go to the Gospel of John, John chapter 18, verses 15 to 27. John 18, 15 to 27. As you're finding that, I'm told that there is a Starbucks, a rather secretive Starbucks, if you will, located in CIA headquarters. And if you know anything about ordering at Starbucks, usually what is done is they take your order. I'm extremely boring when it comes to my Starbucks order, as well as extremely cheap. And so I get the smallest black coffee that they sell. It's still like $8 or something crazy like that. But when you go to order Starbucks coffee at the CIA, they don't ask you your name because typically people in the intelligence community don't like disclosing their name. That makes them pretty uncomfortable, as you can imagine. In fact, when you get your receipt at this particular Starbucks, it does not say anything about buying a coffee at Starbucks. It is rather store number 1. So they just have a lot of different types of ideas. Some people call it the stealthy Starbucks. And so as the baristas have gotten to kind of know their clientele, they don't know their names. They just simply know them by their typical orders. And what's interesting is like they have to be escorted into the property as well as escorted out of the property. And when somebody like their family member or a friend asks them, hey, where did you go to work? They can't say I went to Starbucks at the CIA. They say I work in a federal government building, period. Leave it at that, I guess. So it's kind of interesting. And I say all that because I think we would recognize there are times in life where retaining an identity or concealing an identity is possibly helpful. If you're working in the intelligence community, that would be something that you don't want to readily disclose who you are. But the vast majority of us don't work at Starbucks at the CIA. In fact, we have an identity as Christ followers. And so what does it mean then to disclose that identity of being a follower of Jesus? We're going to look at a story, a particular story that's well known. It's actually found in all 4 gospel accounts. It's Peter's denial of Jesus. And I find this really fascinating, the way the gospel writer John has arranged this material, because we have 3 testimonies. 2 bracketed on each side is Peter's first failed testimony and then his second and third failure. And then in the middle of that is contrasted with Jesus' faithfulness. And so what John wants us to do is he wants us to look intently at these 3 different accounts and see some degree of harmony with them and how Jesus is functioning as a better witness and how Jesus is being a faithful witness. Just like John the Baptist was a witness of Jesus, a testifier very early on in this gospel, we also now have Jesus who is functioning intently as a witness for himself. But he is alone. And he shouldn't be. In fact, if this was a legal Jewish proceeding, he would not be alone. He would have witnesses either testifying for him or against him. But all of those that were supposedly with him, his disciples, that could give the best witness and account and validation for the type of person he was, were all gone. Except for 2. We have the disciple whom Jesus loved, and we have Peter, who are located on the outside looking in. And it is Peter's failure that we are ultimately drawn attention to and that we see. And I think it is with Peter that we have to readily identify ourselves in this story. And that's really the bulk of this message goes to today. How do we look at Peter and how do we see ourselves? Like Peter, we are not immune to a lapse of faith. And like Peter, many of us have followed Jesus for a very, very long time. Think about the degree of intimacy that Peter enjoyed with our Lord over the course of 3 years. Peter had some high watermarks in his life and in his ministry and relationship with Jesus. But now the conversation is private, and all of the spotlight is on Jesus, and seemingly the spotlight is shown on Peter. Would he stand fast in his profession of knowing Jesus? One author has said it this way: John has constructed a dramatic contrast wherein Jesus stands up to his questioners and denies nothing, while Peter cowers before his questioners and denies everything. It's a rather stark contrast. Read with me in John chapter 18. We're going to be looking at verses 15 to 18. This is the first account of Peter's failure. Simon Peter followed Jesus, and so did another disciple. Since that disciple was known to the high priest, he entered with Jesus into the courtyard of the high priest. But Peter stood outside at the door. So the other disciple, who was known to the high priest, went out and spoke to the servant girl who kept watch at the door, and brought Peter in. And the servant girl at the door said to Peter, "You also are not one of this man's disciples, are you?" And here it is. He said, "I am not." Now the servants and officers had made a charcoal fire because it was cold, and they were standing and warming themselves. Peter also was with them, standing and warming himself. I think we just tackle at least this first part. We're going to kind of run through several of these accounts today and just ask questions so we better understand a little bit more about what's happening. If you kind of just look above, you see verses 12 to 14. We read this last week, but there are several preliminary hearings before Jesus goes before the Sanhedrin and has his formal hearing. Now, John doesn't record that aspect in his gospel account. Now, that is actually found in the other gospel accounts. And so what Jesus is doing is having a preliminary hearing first with Annas. And Annas is not technically the high priest, though he's referred to the high priest. It's kind of high priest, not in title, but in influence. And Caiaphas, his son-in-law, is actually the high priest. But before all that takes place, where Jesus is to appear to Caiaphas, he appears to Annas. And it is here that Peter and this other disciple, who's nameless, are watching the interrogation take place, albeit at a distance. So the first question that I think is readily asked is, who is this other disciple? Well, if you know anything about kind of the way stylistically John writes in his gospel account, he often refers to himself as the disciple whom Jesus loved, or the other disciple. We have this appearance of the other disciple even at the crucifixion of Jesus. And so church history and scholars alike really see and identify this other disciple as the gospel writer John. And so a lot of questions then are raised. How in the world did he have access, and how did he know Annas, the high priest? Was there some sort of family relationship? And we don't exactly know. It's somewhat of an argument from silence, but John, we know, was a Galilean fisherman, but he was also probably a wealthy Galilean fisherman. He came from a wealthy family. And so some people have speculated that maybe it is John's father that had a relationship with Annas, and when Annas sees John, he's actually escorted into this courtyard, and there's the invitation then for Peter to come and actually have that conversation as well. So the next question is, well, where are they? Some people have speculated that they're on the temple grounds, and that's probably very, very, very unlikely. And the reason why is because we see that there's a servant girl at the gate. And so there would not be a servant girl at the gate, for example, at the temple. And so what we probably have is Annas's actual residence, and there's a courtyard that probably is shared with Caiaphas, his son-in-law. Exactly. We don't exactly know where this is, but they are having conversation with Jesus there as a preliminary hearing. Now, I think what is more important, though, is what exactly was said. And so as we go through this, you'll see that the tension begins to ramp up on Peter. And the first line of questioning is from this servant girl. And maybe she recognizes Peter, maybe she recognizes his accent, but look at what she says and the way that she frames her question in verse 17. You are not one of this man's disciples, are you? In other words, like she's kind of loading the question, almost like, I think you might be with him. Now, she's a servant girl, so she has no influence over the hearings. So if Peter were to confess that he was in fact Jesus' disciple, it would be a relatively safe confession. But Jesus' failure, or rather Peter's failure in this moment is rather succinct, and it's also rather terse. I am not. And you can almost feel the tension around that little charcoal fire. I am not. Like, I don't want to be asked that any longer. He simply wants to be on the outside looking in. and looking at the proceedings from a distance. Now, there's a little detail here that I think will be picked up later in John's account. And you think, well, what's the significance of the charcoal fire? Well, I think it does a number of things. Number one, it puts us in the springtime, and it would not be uncommon for it to be cold at night. And that's a key detail in this because, as we've said before, there are multiple problems with Jesus' hearing here that make it illegal on its face. Jewish hearings like this were not to be held in the evening. And it was not typical for fires to be constructed like this unless it was a very extraordinary case that called for a lot of people to come together and have some sort of legal hearing. But technically, on the face of it at least, this is technically illegal. And so I think what John does, he also includes this detail to validate and verify that he is an eyewitness to these accounts. Now, the charcoal fire will actually appear later, and I've tried to use some restraint in the construction of this sermon because I really want to go to Jesus' restoration of Peter at the end of the gospel, because we find there another charcoal fire where Peter is asked, "Do you love me? Do you love me? Do you love me?" 3 times in equivalence to his threefold denial of Jesus. There's another charcoal fire there. I'm not going to preach that sermon today. And we're going to focus instead on the rather cheery topic of denying Jesus, because I believe that that's really what we need to be considering again. But John draws these themes together, as we'll see. Now, that's juxtaposed now with Jesus' faithful testimony or faithfulness that we see in verses 19 to 24. And as Peter's failure is so clear, Jesus' performance and his integrity, I think, is so bright. It makes us adore him that much more. Verse 19, the high priest then questioned Jesus about his disciples and his teaching. And Jesus answered him, "I have spoken openly to the world. I have always taught in synagogues and in the temple, where all Jews come together. I have said nothing in secret. Why do you ask me? Ask those who have heard me what I said to them. They know what I said." And when he had said these things, one of the officers standing by struck Jesus with his hand, saying, "Is that how you answer the high priest?" And Jesus answered him, "If what I said is wrong, bear witness about the wrong. But if what I said is right, why do you strike me?" Annas then sent him bound to Caiaphas, the high priest. Now, again, we have to ask the question, where was Jesus? And evidently, he was visible enough to both John and Peter as they were warming themselves around the fire. And this, again, is the preliminary hearing before Annas. And there are another informal lines of questioning here. And really what is being sought for here is to look for ways when they go to the formal proceeding to Caiaphas as he chairs the Sanhedrin to find ways that they can nail Jesus. And so that's exactly what's really happening here. Another problem here with the trial, by the way, this makes it a whole kangaroo court kind of situation, is that technically the defendant was not to be addressed personally. Rather, there were to be witnesses in Jewish law that would be brought to either the defense or the accusation of the defendant. So the fact that they are actually addressing Jesus here and asking him direct questions is a violation of Jewish law. It makes this whole thing, in fact, illegal under the guise of technicality. Now, what Jesus said, though, I think is more important than even where they are. There are 2 lines of questioning that Annas goes for here. Number 1, who are your disciples? Number 2, what is it you taught? And what Annas is looking for here is he's looking for something to nail Jesus, to show him to Rome that he was a dangerous individual, capable of arousing a group of people to overthrow or commit a coup to try to overthrow Rome. That's what Annas wants. Annas wants to get Jesus hung, quite literally, and executed. He does not have the power, though, neither does Caiaphas or the Jewish Sanhedrin, to actually formally execute Jesus. That has to come from Rome, and that was something that was guarded by Rome to really keep the Jewish population as well as all other occupations that they had under their order and control. They had the priority and the ability to execute. The Jews did not. Now, what's so interesting, though, about the way Jesus responds, notice that he sidesteps the first question. And you think, well, why is that? Why doesn't he talk about his disciples? Well, even in this moment, this high degree of stress, we find Jesus caring for his disciples. He could have easily said, hey, there's 2 of them out there, why don't you ask them? I mean, it's just that he could have done that. And he would have been within his rights to do that. But he didn't. Why not? Well, I think he knew very clearly, in fact, he had already predicted that Peter would fail. And he knew that John's faithfulness to Jesus here hung on a thread. And so, rather than bringing them into the circle, so to speak, of danger, he is acting as a good shepherd, even to this point, and guarding them. It tells us a little bit about the character of Jesus, does it not? It helps us to admire him that much more. Now, the second thing, though, that he goes to is he does address that which he teaches. But I love how Jesus kind of cleverly turns the tables here on Annas and the rest of the members here of the Sanhedrin. He says, I've been teaching you publicly all along. Where were you? If you want to know what I've been saying, you merely just need to listen. And cleverly, Jesus says something about the world. He says that he has spoken to the world. I've spoken openly to the world. If you know anything about John's theology and the way he uses these words is very important. The world is a stand-in for the totality of the unbelieving, unregenerate parcel of humanity. In other words, what Jesus is saying is that I have spoken openly to all those who don't believe. And he doesn't get into the details and the weeds of theology. In fact, if he were to say on its face, I am the Son of God, they wouldn't have believed him anyways. Now, there's another problem that happens in this trial. And Jesus is struck. And the word here in the Greek that is used is literally on the back of the hand. That would have been indefensible as well. That defendants were not to be struck like this. And again, Jesus does not react. He maintains his composure. He's sinless even to the very end. If what I said is wrong, bear witness about the wrong. In other words, he's calling to account a testimony, a testifier. But for what I said is right, why do you strike me? In other words, what Jesus is saying is this whole trial is a farce, and you know it. And it is their anger and their jealousy and their rage and the mob mentality that is beginning to take them by force. And they are completely disregarding any kind of procedure or anything of the sort. They want Jesus killed. Could not be more clear. Now let's bounce back to the charcoal fire. And we are to compare what Jesus says now to Peter in verses 25 to 27. Now Simon Peter was standing and warming himself. So it's important, they said to him, you are not one of his disciples, are you? He denied it and said, I am not. One of the servants of the high priest, a relative of the man whose ear Peter had cut off, asked, did I not see you in the garden with him? Peter again denied it, and at once a rooster crowed. It's a sad, sad part of Peter's life. And notice how with each subsequent denial, here the second and the third denial of Peter, the tension ramps up that much more. At first it was a servant girl, and then we have a group of people that begin questioning Peter. They, whoever they are, perhaps those that were around the fire with him, that they recognized him or they perceived his accent as a Galilean, or maybe they recognized him traveling with Jesus prior in the events of that week. And then it gets very, very personal. There is a servant to the other person whose ear that Peter cut off, and Peter probably thinks in this moment, if I were to say, yes, I am a follower of Jesus, I'm going right where Jesus is. In fact, they're going to try me for attempted murder. Because we saw last week that he swung a dagger and he cut off the servant's ear, probably missing his head. Of course, we know that Jesus healed the ear of the servant. And so in these moments, we have just a glaring spotlight on Peter's failure. And it's rather sad. Now, I don't want to spend a whole lot of time here, but some people have tried to kind of harmonize all four gospel accounts here and try to come up with what exactly were the chronology and the events that took place here so that we might better understand how all four gospel writers put this together. All four gospel writers actually record Peter's denial. And so if you were to do that, you'd probably come up with this, that there were stages of Peter's denials. Not all four gospel writers record the same salient details about Jesus, but all of them record that Jesus was denied by Peter 3 times, as well as he denied it when the rooster crowed. This would have been sometime between about midnight and 3 a.m., so quite literally in the middle of the night. And so if you take all those details together, what you see is that Peter probably in 3 different stages denied Jesus. John records some of them, the other gospel writers record the others, but this was an enduring denial. This wasn't just a spur-of-the-moment kind of denial. In other words, as Peter was looking at Jesus, it became very clear to him that Jesus and the world that he constructed with Peter over the course of 3 years was toppling down. And if Peter was to adhere to allegiance to Jesus, if he was to affirm the fact that he was Christ's follower, he very likely would be executed with Jesus. And so it raises the question, I think, for me, and some of this is an argument from silence, but why did Peter deny? I mean, if you think about Peter's life, I mean, he has some of the highest highs and here some of the lowest lows. The gospel writer Luke says that Jesus and Peter locked eyes. Now think about that for a minute. And what was Peter's response? He left and he wept bitterly. He wept. He knew very, very well his failure. In fact, I think even when he locked eyes with Jesus, it dawned on him that, oh yes, Jesus, even not very many hours earlier, had predicted that he would do this. But think about Peter's life for a moment. I mean, in the Gospel of John, I mean, some of the high points here, Jesus, as he's being abandoned in the 6th chapter of John, says, would you like to leave as well? And Peter, speaking up for the rest of the disciples, said, to whom shall we go? You have the words of eternal life. Remember when Jesus is washing the disciples' feet, Peter somewhat compulsively says, wash all of me, right? He says, no, you just need to wash your feet. Jesus, or rather Peter says to Jesus that he would lay down his life in John chapter 13. Here he had the opportunity to do that. While it's somewhat violent and misguided, I think we would admire at least some of his courage in the garden last week as we looked at Peter swinging the sword. But Peter had some failures. And here we see that Peter is prone to fear, maybe fear of what would happen to him. He's prone to being desirous of self-preservation. I think Peter is confused. I think he's disillusioned. I think things are happening so fast around him, his mind can't quite, comprehend and kind of make sense of what's happening around him. So it compels him to deny. I think what we find in Peter is a great symbol of human frailty and human weakness that all of us, if we're being honest and looking at ourselves in the mirror, have. Peter has tremendous and profound remorse from this. And I do think that this probably stayed with Peter for the endurance of his ministry. I don't think Peter ever moved on. I don't think Peter ever forgot about his denial. Now, that doesn't mean that Peter dwelled on it. It doesn't mean that he dwelled on the past. He experienced God's grace in a very profound way after the resurrection of Jesus that we'll see later. But Peter never moved on. And so I just want to take some moments here, and I've been thinking about this all week. How in the world do we apply this? Because we're not faced with the same degree of tensions, all of us, and also we're not faced with the same potential to be executed. Maybe someday we will be, but for the vast majority of us, that's not necessarily the case. Well, I think the gospel writer of John wants us first to look to Jesus. I think we look to Jesus, and what is it about Jesus that we want to emulate? Jesus stood firm. He maintains a sinless countenance, a sinless heart. though he knew very well that his trial was illegal, he doesn't necessarily call attention to that. He was very firm and resolute. He understood very well what his mission was, despite there would be those that would try to railroad it. He knew that this was all part of a larger plan, that God, his Father, was sending him to the cross, and this was the means of him to get there. He maintains his nerve. That's one of the things I think that you see in these trial accounts of Jesus, going all the way even to the upper room, the Garden of Gethsemane. You see that Jesus maintains his nerve under tremendous, tremendous pressure. I don't know about you, but I want to emulate that. I want to be like that. I want to be like Jesus. But we find ourselves perhaps drawn, and probably rightly so, to look to Peter more so than Jesus. And so what is it about Peter that we identify ourselves in? I think, first of all, we see that we all have a temptation for self-preservation. We all have that temptation. You know, it may not be that we affirm or deny Jesus, but maybe it's a situation where we want to bend the truth just a little bit. We want to kind of manipulate it just a few ticks on the dial so that it makes ourselves look a little bit better. Is not Peter doing just that? You know, an outright denial, but he's manipulating the situation. He's also probably thinking about ways to self-justify himself. Oh, I'll deny Jesus here, but, when all this is done, we'll patch things up, we'll kind of, move on and that sort of thing. There's a lot of things I think that are going through Peter's mind. Number two, like Peter, we must acknowledge our failures. Again, Peter acknowledged this. It was in that moment, I think, of that eye contact with Jesus that it dawned on him. I don't think it was lost on him at all of his failure. And when we fail, I think the application is here that we simply affirm it. We don't qualify it. We don't say, yeah, but, the devil made me do it, or, the situation that I was in. Peter here has to come to terms with his failure. He has to come to terms. Number three, and this is what we want to strive for, let us not back down from our convictions when we're faced with potential persecution for them. I don't know what persecution looks like for you. There are many, many ranges of persecution. One writer has kind of put it this way, and this somewhat pedantically. I'm going to go through 17 ranges from lesser to extreme of persecution. And you might find yourself in all of these at some point. Number one, disapproval. 2, ridicule. 3, a pressure to conform. 4, a loss of opportunities. 5, economic sanctions. 6, shunning. 7, alienation from the community. 8, loss of employment. 9, loss of property. By the way, in the letter to the Hebrews, the author of Hebrews says, you rejoiced when your property was plundered so that you might be known as a follower of Jesus and share in his sufferings. Number 10, this gets more and more emphatic, physical abuse. 11, mob violence. 12, harassment by officials. 13, kidnapping. 14, forced labor. 15, imprisonment. 16, physical torture. And 17, murder or execution. Now, I think all of us, by virtue of living in this country, have not experienced the latter half of that list. But you will experience the former. You will experience perhaps ridicule in work, a pressure to conform to some sort of standards perhaps in your job or environment that you're in. Maybe a loss of opportunities or economic impacts. Maybe you won't get the raise that you want or that you're hoping for. If you just bend your truth just a little bit. One person has said this, the greatest criticism of the church today is that no one wants to persecute it because there's nothing very much to persecute it about. That's stinging. As you continue on, though, I think that Peter teaches us that we need not really fear human beings. That's what Peter's fearful of. He's fearful of human beings, of agencies. He's fearful of government control. We need not fear. This was something that actually followed Peter later on, even in his life. You don't have to turn there, but in Galatians, the letter of Galatians, we love our brother Apostle Paul, the Apostle Paul, because, he's like type A driven, right? And he can't stand people that like bend even a little bit. And even like the great Peter, the pillar of the Jerusalem church, Paul says, man, I got this on him. In fact, Paul, even earlier in his letter, Galatians 1:10, said this. He says, for am I now seeking the approval of man or of God? Or am I trying to please man? If I were still trying to please man, I would not be a servant of Christ. And he remembers, in fact, he rehearses that Cephas here, Peter, actually shrinks under pressure again for the integrity of the gospel when he is confronted with Jewish believers, and he begins to side with them over dietary restrictions. And Paul reminds us here of this, Galatians 2:11. But when Cephas came to Antioch, I opposed him to his face because he stood condemned. For before certain men came from James, he was eating with the Gentiles, but when they came, he drew back and separated himself, fearing the circumcision party. This was something that Peter admittedly struggled with. But we need not fear human beings. Number 5, let us learn from our failures and not dwell on them. Again, I think Peter, I think he learned from this. In fact, he had to go through a painful restoration later on when Jesus was resurrected, not very many weeks later. And we'll get there when we get to the end of this gospel. But I think that Peter learned from this. Though he still struggled with fearing human beings, I think he struggled and learned from his struggle. He learned from his failures. He didn't dwell on them, but he moved forward. Number 6, let us lean on one another for growth. There's a really beautiful story about this. You guys might know the name Derek Redmond, if any of you are Olympic fans. So Derek Redmond was a British sprinter, ran the 400 meters. And in Atlanta, 1996, in the Summer Games in Atlanta, he was actually the favorite to win the gold in the 400 meters. And if you go watch this on YouTube, it's quite dramatic. About halfway through the race, he feels something pop in one of his hamstrings, and he crumbles to the ground on the track. And at that moment, he knew all the training, all the work, all the dreams of winning a gold medal in the Olympics was over like that. And there was this person that came down from the stands. You remember this? And you see in the video, like some of the security people are like, well, we don't know what to do with this. This is not something that we're typically, think about. And he kind of brushed them aside, and you see Derek kind of wave them on. The person that came to his aid was his father. And they began to sob together right there on the track in the failure, that they felt together. But the two of them locked arm in arm and limped across the finish line. That disqualified Derek, by the way, but nobody cared. It was a poignant moment in the Olympics that summer, and the same is true for us. When you fail, you need the assistance and the help and the grace that you can receive from others in the church. Don't alienate yourself from others. And the last thing is this: remember that those that deny Christ may be restored to him. I want to kind of just give a special word to parents of kids that have walked away or denied Christ through whatever capacity, maybe early on, maybe they went through trials, I'm not sure, but all of us have people in our lives that we have felt that, but especially for you parents that have kids that have denied Christ, I don't know of anything more painful that you've gone through. You just don't know. I don't want to give you false hope, but I also want to say that you just don't know how Christ will use those circumstances in somebody's life to bring somebody back, that they might experience the grace of our Lord in a very profound, real way. That goes for all of us here. All of us have failed in some way, some shape or form. Maybe we haven't denied Jesus in front of accusers like Peter, but all of us have failed. All we like sheep have gone astray. Each of us has turned to our own way, but the Lord has caused the iniquity of us all to fall on him. Isaiah 53:6. One author says this: God uses broken things, broken soil to produce a crop, broken clouds to give rain, broken grain to give bread, broken bread to give strength. It is the broken alabaster box that gives forth perfume. It is Peter weeping bitterly who returns to greater power than ever. May the same be true for us restored failures. Father, we love you. We thank you so much for the grace that is abounding in Jesus Christ and the gospel work. As Jesus here, as we read, was going to be killed and going to be crucified and sacrificed on behalf of us failed sinners. May we find our own failures and see them in light of the failures of Peter, who was restored by the matchless, merciful grace that abounds, superabounds in the gospel of Jesus. If anyone's here today that has never tasted that grace for the first time, maybe they're trying to make up for past failures, Father, may they simply acknowledge it, may they affirm it, may they lock eyes with Jesus, and may they see in those eyes a resolve of love and grace and welcome, because on account of his death, burial, and resurrection, he has overcome our failures. So let us look to Jesus. It's in his name we pray. Amen.